Stephen Smith is a certified arborist and forester with the Urban Forest Associates. Stephen and his company have been active in the management of Toronto's ravine forests for over 30 years, working for many private homeowners, institutions, and nonprofits, as well as the City of Toronto and Toronto Region Conservation Authority. So today, Stephen will be discussing what we should do about aggressive native plants in our projects, and will offer some solutions.
Okay, good to meet you. Today we're going to talk about a topic that sometimes gets talked about by us at these different meetings, but it really doesn't come up very often in most of the public presentations I hear from anybody else. One of the things that I hear from the public is I tell them that they need to remove certain plants to favor other plants. And they'll kind of say to me, well, why should we remove that? That's goldenrod. Goldenrod's a great species that feeds all these pollinators. But, you know, the goldenrod is as tall as I am, and the plant that we're trying to protect has just been planted and it's 6 inches tall right beside it. The other plant needs the help more than we need one more goldenrod in the world. So that's started me thinking about what other things do we do that we have to explain to people, and maybe some of you aren't aware of. So that's where it goes from here. Aggressive native and near native. I'm a believer in there is a native and there is near native, and just because you can move things around, maybe we shouldn't always, or at least we have to think about the implications of doing it. So what do I mean by aggressive natives? Generally, if we found an alien plant that spread as aggressively as some of the plants that we deal with every day and sometimes we plant, we would call it invasive. It can become a pain. It can get in the way of things that we're trying to do, and we need to control it. When we try to control it, sometimes they're very difficult. Some natives are no easier to kill than some of the more problematic invasives that we deal with. And native species can compete with other native species. And we have to decide when we've made up a project, what we want our target plant community to be. I don't just pick a generalist suite of species, you know, a bunch of trees, a bunch of shrubs that grow pretty much everywhere, and plant them over a field at random spacing just to fill it up, just for canopy cover, and then my job is done. I'm always thinking about what kind of plant community do I want to have on this site in the future, and how do I get there from now? I'm not sure that that's what everybody's thinking when they're planning their projects. But if a species reproduces quickly and aggressively and persists, then that's what we want things to do, but you can get too many of them as well. And that's basically what this whole page boils down to. And I thought that the quote down below by Credit Valley Conservation Authority, invasive species are scratched out non-native species that displace native species, dominate ecosystems, and impact ecological integrity and ecosystem function. Any plant can do that. And this is where we get into some of the things that the keynote speaker also said. We need to decide what we want and then work towards having that on the site, rather than just letting things go the way they want to go without making those decisions. So as a first example, this is a typical planting project that you see going on in a lot of places, a lot of generalist species, and there's a mix. They're attempt to cluster anything. So you can have growing trees with slow growing trees and shrubs. They can be a mix, they can be deliberately put in a certain way, or they can just be random. And then whatever grows here will be the most aggressive, fastest growing, the strongest survivors. And it's kind of, they're competing with each other. We can, as managers of the sites, we can control that and try to guide it towards what we want it to be, or we can just let nature take its course. If you're working on meadows in particular have a lot of constraints on them, and this one especially because it's got hydro lines above it. But everything competes with meadows. A meadow is a transitional type of community in this part of the world. So it is going to become a forest if you leave it alone long enough. And it will fill up, whether with natives or non-natives. It's going to fill up with woody plants if you leave it alone. And wetlands and or in this case, stormwater ponds are in the same way, except that in a lot of cases, they are planted not only with just woodies or just herbaceous, but you often find that they're planted with a mix because erosion control is a high priority so that they work on the woody component as well as the herbaceous component without sometimes thinking about what's going to happen down the road. Just as examples, some of the main species we're thinking about. Tall goldenrod or Canada goldenrod in other parts of Ontario. Grape, the creepers, thicket or Virginia. We get thicket around here. If you're south of Toronto, you tend to get a lot more Virginia. Stag, gray dogwood, trembling aspen, cup plant, surprise. And new species coming into our area being planted, hackberry, Kentucky coffee tree. And then of course, there's the old favorite black walnut, which is a legacy of the old M&R plantations from the 1940s to the 1960s for the most part. Though it is native here, probably never very common in the past. That said, think of some other species, and this can be really site specific too. If you're working on the Toronto waterfront, you will probably have an overabundance of sandbar willow or red osier dogwood. And those can form very dense thickets with very little else growing in and around them. If that's the goal of your project, that's fine, but I wouldn't want to have to manage them over large areas. That could take a lot of effort. So starting with goldenrod, I'm going to go through each one of these species. This is actually one that is listed as an invasive species in Europe because of aggressiveness. It has been planted there as an ornamental and escaped, just like the problems we have here with other species. I have never seen it as dense as what you see in this picture, but I guess it is possible because this picture was taken in North America. Goldenrod is a wonderful species to have. Fantastic. It's a keystone species. I dare to use that word, but I think it is. But if you're planting other species in your meadow restoration, you have to control the goldenrod. Otherwise, all you're going to have in 5 years is more goldenrod. They can also invade forests that have been opened up by the removal of buckthorn and any place that's been opened up to allow more sunlight to come in. You don't have to control them forever, but you may have to control them for the initial establishment period, and you need to plan for that. Even those of us that have been controlling invasives for a long time, so the two natives that we've been controlling in addition to all the others, even when people don't want us cutting natives down, the vines. Grapevine and creeper can carpet absolutely everything. And we need to accept that and work with it and either use it or deal with it immediately. These are cedars, and I've seen them outright killed by being covered over. But this is also a good way to get rid of invasives if you can work that to your advantage. And that's creeper. Again, the same line of cedars, actually, just in a different spot. Both vines kind of going crazy over desirable natives. And on that note, I would say that from a conservation perspective, conifers are probably a very high priority in our area because we're on the edge of the deciduous forest region, south of us, where there aren't very many conifers, and further north you get the mixed forest region, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, where conifers are more common. Conifers are very high value wildlife habitat. So anything that competes with conifers is important, regardless of whether it's native or whether it provides habitat. I think we need to work hard to keep the conifers on the landscape in our part of Ontario. And one of my old favorites, Staghorn Sumac. You can grow this project as a fast cover species. It makes it look good for your funders because it grows so fast and it turns red in the fall. So it's great for pictures. In this picture, and you can't see them very well, there are cedars and spruces planted, but they're shorter than Michael is, and so they're kind of hard to see in amongst this sea of Staghorn Sumac. Now, I planted all of that, and I knew this was going to happen. You notice that the sumacs are far enough apart that trees can get between them. And on the right side, you can even see a trembling aspen coming up. That's also a planted one. But Michael's 6 feet tall, and these are 3-year-old sumacs. So that's how big they get in only 3 years. Not a bad thing, as long as you plan for it. But if this is a surprise to you, what are you going to do if it's holding back the other species that you're trying to grow? And what if you've done this on the edge of your meadow planting? How are you going to never-ending onslaught of sumac that's going to be growing into your planting area? Now, this is a project that I did 28 years ago, where we planted an open lawn. It looked exactly like the lawn in front of us when we planted it with tree seedlings, but we put sumac in only on the outer edge of this planting to sort of create a boundary for it. The sumac is now 15, 18 feet high, and it's formed a dense colony. It should get that big. And the trees behind it, which were a foot tall when they were put in, are now 40 or 50 feet high. And this picture was taken a few years ago. This is what I would recommend doing with sumac if you want to use sumac, as opposed to making it a uniform cover. If you go inside the edge of the forest, on the left side of the picture, there's still the very dense growth of young sumac. But as soon as you get past that first 20-foot wide edge, then we're into where the sumac wasn't before, and it now can't invade deeper into the forest because of the shade of the larger trees that are there. So this has been very successful for what I wanted it to do, which is creating an edge for the forest. But I also, if I wanted to plant herbaceous plants into this forest, there's be no chance because it's just too dense in there. You can't do that if you're using sumac. Another thing that we get with sumacs is sometimes they grow a lot faster than the planted trees. In this case, a white pine. That pine will never get to maturity. So if you did what I did at the beginning, mixing sumac with conifers, this might be the result without some management. And this takes a lot of management. There's a lot of stems there to cut to free up that pine. And they're so much bigger than the pine is by now that you would have to wait 8 or 10 years and manage during those 8 or 10 years in order for that pine to ever catch up to the sumacs and get above them where it's safe. Probably won't happen in this case. So mixing them can be very dangerous. Another common species that we use in our reforestation projects is gray dogwood, these purple colored plants at the front. Very, very dense forming plant. Great if you're trying to fight against dog strangling vine, because if it's there before the dog strangling vine comes onto your site, it will resist it and you'll only get a couple. You probably can't plant it into dog strangling vine and have it dominate though. It'll be a hard go, but maybe over 20 or 30 years they'll win. But another one that you see how close together those stems are. You cannot get herbaceous to survive around the dense gray dogwood colonies. It will win. If you're not planning on planting herbaceous though, this is what's going to happen to the gray dogwood over the years. It's going to get suppressed by the growth of the trees and eventually become an understory shrub. And only the ones that are along the edge in the sun will survive. The other ones will completely die out. This is a 30 or 35-year-old planting, but because the trees are growing on really lousy urban soil, they've grown very slowly and they haven't formed a full canopy. So the gray dogwood is still hanging in there after all these years. Same picture as the one with the gray dogwood, but behind them is this large mass of trembling aspen. I put this here because I wanted to create a nice forest of aspen, but very dense, very hard to get anything to grow around it. And again, if you had an open habitat like a prairie or a meadow planting right beside it, you would be constantly fighting against aspen. So I advise that you don't do that. If you are doing meadow plantings, cup plant is a great plant because it's beautiful and it feeds wildlife and it's very attractive. But all of this in this picture grew from one plant in 10 years. And the cup plant that I had in my back garden was 12 feet tall when I finally cut it down because it was getting so big for my garden, I didn't have room for it. The same thing will happen in your prairie plantings or meadow plantings. This can outcompete just about everything. There's no woody regeneration coming up in the middle of it all. No invasives either, so it is doing a job. But you need to know this if you're planting cup plant. You may end up with acres of it. One of the species that people are just getting to know around here, Kentucky coffee tree. And I didn't know this 20 years ago because I hadn't been planting them, but Kentucky coffee tree reproduces by suckers and forms colonies that look an awful lot like black locust. Very, very dense, heavy canopy, and wherever you see a lot of them, there's not a lot growing underneath them. So what's going to happen with succession over time? Here's another shot of an older grove in a park not far from my house. The largest tree in the back is about 8 or 10 inches in diameter, and the ones at the front of the colony are 3 or 4 inches, along with seedlings coming up in front of it. There's no sunlight getting through the canopy in this area to create an understory. So if this is what you want, then fine. But if you're trying to encourage succession to a variety of species, this is going to be one of the ones you're going to have to watch out for. And the legacy of the old M&R plantings. All these dots on this nice winter shot are showing black walnut regeneration. You rarely get one black walnut in place. You get a lot of them. And interestingly, on this site, and it's the same site from 2 different angles. This is an old wildflower meadow planting that was planted in about 2002, but then it wasn't maintained after about the first 2 years. There's a grove of gray dogwood where the people are standing on the trail. But the other dots here are young black walnuts that are coming up because there's a large tree across the trail that's been seeding in, and this site hasn't been maintained. This is going to become a forest of walnut. It's going to shade out all of the other shrubs, and the herbaceous species that were planted, which are actually right where you see these plants on the left, they're all long gone because of the shading from the walnut. So you can get too much of a good thing. And another one that isn't naturally found in our area, but is close, this is regeneration of hackberry. I hadn't seen this going on very much until this year, and I noticed this. It's an old planting done by the city, and the trees that were planted are getting close to 10 inches in diameter, but around them, there's this very dense area. And all of these seedlings that we're looking at in this picture are hackberry. Again, you don't get very much growing on the ground, and you probably never will with this kind of density. So, and it's an introduced species in our area. So are we going to get regeneration of other desirables, or are we just going to be creating a new plant community in Toronto that never existed before? Is this what we want? This is another spot, again, with hackberry growing along the edge. Behind it, I believe, is a black walnut. And this is a place that I'm starting to see it come up a lot. I describe this as the urban roadside tree community. It used to be dominated by Manitoba maple, ash, white elm, black walnut, and mulberry in many cases. And hackberry is starting to join that disturbance forest community, along, of course, buckthorn to be in that mix. This is starting to become more and more common. So what are the implications of this? I've alluded to them a little bit by now. Increase of costs or management effort where you never expected to have to spend the effort before. You thought you'd plant things and maybe you'd control a few of the usual invasives now and then, but you wouldn't have to think about controlling other natives to get to your goals of what you wanted to do in your project. And this choice is often made at the beginning of a project when somebody makes up a plant list and just chooses a whole bunch of species that have survived very well on previous projects. Let's plant more of those ones without realizing what's going to happen down the road. And, you know, will you have the money or the time to do that when that time comes down the road? The other thing about it is we're taking spaces away in a crowded environment, certainly here in the city, but in other parts of Ontario too, where we're not going to get conservative species established. If your site fills up with trembling aspen and staghorn sumac and gray dogwood or hackberries, because they're also shade tolerant, where is going to be the next place for white oak and shagbark hickory to reproduce naturally, or for you to plant it. Now, considering that you often can't buy these seedlings 6 inches tall, you have to have a wide open field with no competition to get those to survive. So thinking, well, I'll plant them later when I get a chance. Well, if you're competing with a 10-foot tall colony of sumac, you're not going to get the chance. The hickories just aren't going to survive long enough to get through that canopy. So we're making an unconscious choice to go with the most aggressive natives across the landscape in large areas when we do plantings or selective management of natural stands, instead of creating spaces for these rare species that we're trying to encourage. And something James Kamstra said in the break earlier, if you're a slow growing native plant, you're looking for a place to grow, and you're just as much threatened by hackberry or gray dogwood as you are by invasive species or by somebody flattening the place for urban development. You're still gone, and they're gone off the landscape. Maybe they only remain environmentally sensitive areas, or maybe they're just completely gone and replaced by common species that are fast growing and easy to maintain. So what can you do about it? Unless you want this to happen. Now, this is a technique you can use if you want. Plant a few of these really aggressive ones spaced out across the site and just let nature take its course. Not a bad solution if you've got a very large area and not much money to spend. Okay. If you're planting any kind of a meadow or even a garden, you do have to control the goldenrods, at least for the first few years until the other plants are established. But if you want to maintain a good diversity of plant species on your site, you are going to have to plant fewer of these really aggressive ones, or plant them at the far edges or in places where they're not going to have a chance to reproduce very much. But you don't have to plant many of them. Save money or spend the money on buying more shagbark hickories instead of more sumacs. And if you've already got vines on your site, or if you want to plant some and you don't have a lot of ability to control the invasives because your budgets are limited, or you've got limits on what you're allowed to do, plant the vines right next to your colonies of invasive species. Let them completely overtop them and wipe them out. And I've seen this happen. I've allowed it to happen. I will cut a grapevine off of an oak, but I'll let it grow on a Manitoba maple or a Norway maple. Use them selectively to control some of the invasives. And if you're planting a meadow, stay away from these species completely. I mean, really, unless you have to, should you even plant any woody species in your meadows? Because you're just fighting against succession. You're always going to be fighting against succession when you're doing meadows. Choose the less aggressive ones if you can. Any species that reproduces by suckers or rhizomes is probably something you don't want. So, and I will end it there, but I'll leave you with this website that I found a few years ago. I rediscovered it yesterday on oak savannas, which tells you a lot about the things I've been talking about. And if you scroll down further, you'll see that it says non-native species on the start of that list. If you go a little bit further, you'll find native species on that list. And it tells you how to control them. We're all in the vegetation management business if we're doing this kind of work. So we need to think about what we want and what we don't want. And at least for the ones that we're planting or deciding what lives and dies, we can favor the more conservative species, the rarer species, the ones that need certain types of habitats that aren't common, whenever we're standing there with a chainsaw or a bottle of herbicide in our hand, trying to figure out what lives and what dies. So I can leave it there. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. That was very interesting. Yeah, made salient some thoughts I'd kind of had about certain plants that you come across in the woods, like trembling aspen, for instance, is one I always see that looks invasive when you come across it from time to time. We are a little bit behind here, but I do want to make time for one question. Is Kentucky coffee tree not a desirable native tree since it is a species at risk? So Katrina wanted more information on that.
It is a species at risk, and they're interpreting that as being anywhere that's occurring naturally. It's not a species at risk when it's on your front lawn. Nobody wants to regulate that, but in natural or semi-natural areas, it is being treated like a species at risk. Another reason why maybe you shouldn't be planting it if you're worried about it reproducing too aggressively.